Welcome to our Whalen Library event. Tonight we are excited to have Anders Morley here to talk about his Canadian adventures as chronicled in his book, which you can borrow from the library, This Land of Snow, A Journey Across the North in Winter. Anders is a dual citizen of the US and Canada and grew up in New Hampshire. He began skiing at age 5. He's worked as a translator and a teacher in Italy, a tree planter in Saskatchewan, and a forester's assistant in British Columbia. He holds a master's in ancient history from the University of St. Andrews and has studied history and modern languages at Columbia, Edinburgh University, and the University of Bergamo. He contributes regularly to New Hampshire Magazine, and his work has also appeared in a variety of publications, including the Globe and Mail and Northern Woodlands Magazine. Thank you so much to Anders for being here tonight. I just have a couple Zoom housekeeping notes. We are recording, as you probably already realized, hopefully for broadcast on Waycam, a local cable access station, and also for the library's YouTube page, so you'll be able to rewatch and share. I recommend you switch your view to speaker view, so you'll see Anders' slides when he presents them. And feel free to put any questions in the Zoom chat at any point. And also, I believe Anders will be presenting for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session, and you're welcome to unmute and speak up then. So now I will hand it over to Anders.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Courtney, and thank you for your help with putting this event together. And thanks to the Whalen Library. And lastly, thank you to all of you whom I can't see, but I know there are some people here. Thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy my talk. So I'm here to talk this evening, as Courtney said, about my book, This Land of Snow, A Journey Across the Northern Winter, which came out at the end of last year. It was published by Mountaineers Books. And as Courtney also said, it chronicles the a winter that I spent outside 4 months traveling on cross-country skis across the northwestern Canada. So what I'd like to do this evening is talk a little bit about how the journey came to be, its background, how and why it occurred to me to do something like this. And then I want to talk a bit about the journey and show you some pictures, and I'm going to stop at a couple of points along the way to read a couple of passages just to give you a taste of what the book is like, in case you're interested in reading it. So when I sat down to write a book about this journey, one of the questions that I had to address was how did you get the idea to set off on skis and across a fairly hostile landscape and spend that time living outdoors? And I could have just begun the story with the moment my skis hit the ground and made a story of the adventure and then ended it when I left the trail. But I thought that the story had some significance in the context of my life. It didn't seem exactly like a normal decision for someone to make. And so I find it a starting point for my story. And I thought of a few possibilities, and I want to switch over to screen share now so that you can see some pictures. Okay. Bear with me. Full screen. Okay. Can someone give me a thumbs up if you see? Okay, great. So one of the possible starting places I came up with was this guy. This is a skier called Tony Matt, who in New Hampshire is a relatively well-known figure. Tony Matt came over to New Hampshire from Austria in 1938 at the time of the Anschluss, when Austria was annexed by the Nazis. And he came over with a few other Austrian skiers, one of whom was an older skier called Hannes Schneider, who founded a ski school in North Conway. And he brought over a few other skiers from home, and one of them was this guy, Tony Matt. Tony Matt is famous most of all, at least in New Hampshire, for his participation in a ski race down the slopes of Mount Washington in 1939. The race was called the American Inferno. It was run 3 times, and 1939 was the last time it was run. Tony Matt won the race when he skied from the top of Mount Washington to the bottom in 6.5 minutes, which, if any of you who've ever hiked up Mount Washington, you know it takes much more than 6.5 minutes to get up from bottom to top. But this was by any standard a very fast time. So the previous winner of the American Inferno had taken over 12 minutes to get from the top of the mountain to the bottom. So he halved the time, and is thought to have hit 90 miles an hour on his way over the head wall of Tuckerman Ravine, which is that cirque you see in the middle of the picture. It's very steep, and it's a very long way down. So why am I telling the story? It's a story that I heard a lot when I was a kid. I spent lots of time with my brothers and my father hiking around Mount Washington in the summertime. And in the winter, we skied a lot at Wildcat Mountain, which is just across the valley from Mount Washington. So we were always looking at this huge mountain. And my dad loved to tell the story of Tony Matt. And the way that he told the story, he would say, Tony Matt raced down the mountain 6.5 minutes. And when he got to the bottom at Pinkham Notch, he was so terrified of what he'd just done that he picked up his skis, put them down behind his car, and backed over them and snapped them in half. They were wooden skis. Snapped them in half and then drove off into the sunset and never skied again. It was pretty dramatic, a pretty dramatic way to end the story. And so when I sat down to think about how I might frame my own story of skiing, in which this idea of kind of overdoing it with skiing is a key element, I thought that it was a nice way to frame the story. I started skiing when I was about 5 years old. I'm hearing someone's trying to talk to me, or it's just background noise, right? Okay. I started skiing when I was 5 years old, downhill skiing. And then when I was about 10, I started cross-country skiing. And so that's just kind of a context. Skiing was always important to me, and I had these stories in my mind. Now, at this point, I want to fast forward about 20 years to the years just after I'd finished college, and I was in graduate school. And I was studying German, or I needed to study German, I should say. I needed to learn German quickly for what I was working on, my research in graduate school. And so I decided to spend a semester studying in Germany, studying German in a German language institute. And while I was there, I met the woman that you see in this picture. And we became a couple, and eventually she became my wife. She was Italian, and she was also in Germany, learning German. And so after finishing, my graduate studies, I moved to Italy, and I ended up living there in this city called Bergamo for close to a decade. And it's a lovely place. It's in northern Italy. It's right at the foot of the Alps. You can see the foothills just in the background of this picture. And there were lots of things that I liked about it. But after about 10 years, I started to feel extremely uneasy and unhappy for some reason. It wasn't exactly clear why. I knew that homesickness was part of it. I also had a vague sense that I wasn't doing the kinds of things that I had thought I wanted to do in life when I was, in my early 20s, kind of when I decided to go to Italy and to be with Elena, who was my wife. And this sort of unease manifested itself in a kind of almost a dislike, to put it simply, a dislike of all things Italian. Everything around me became sort of, I thought of my environment as the source of my unease. And so these next couple of pictures are just to illustrate an episode which is actually in the book. This episode is meant to just to give you an idea of how I was thinking at the time. So I was up in the foothills of the Alps on a walk, and I came to this little prospect looking down on this village, or what Italians considered a village. This is a little village called Olera. with about 300 inhabitants. And the first thing I thought when I looked down that particular day at this place, which I'd seen many times, was that's not a village. That looks like a city block that's been dropped into the mountains. Because I was convinced that this is what a village of 300 people was supposed to look like. This, this New England scene. Now, obviously, now I recognize this is absurd. Of course, people in different countries have different ways of organizing population, but it's just to give you a sense of how sort of alienated I had begun to feel in my surroundings. And it was while I was enthralled to this weird way of thinking that I bought a National Geographic one day at the newsstand. And when I got home and opened it up, it fell open to this picture, which was attached to a story about an adventurer whose name is Andrew Skurka. He's an American. He's from Massachusetts, actually, originally. And he had just completed this huge circuit of Alaska and the Yukon, partly on foot hiking and partly on cross-country skis in the higher altitudes, and partly in a pack raft. Now, the journey itself had this circular form, and it had a kind of elegance that I thought was wonderful. But it was really just this picture that leapt out at me, and somehow I saw this as kind of the cure to my ills, to my sense of unease. I need to go into some wild place on my home continent in North America where there was more space and everything was less claustrophobic than in Italy as I saw it then. And this was it. I'd been a skier in all my life, and I was interested in. I'd always wanted to take some kind of a long distance self-propelled journey. Admittedly, I'd pictured something more conventional like the Appalachian Trail or something, but now I thought, I know I should do it in the winter on cross-country skis. And I started to think a lot of this guy as well. This is Friedroff Nansen, the Norwegian explorer, who had been kind of a hero of mine in my late teen years, my early 20s. Friedroff Nansen, his first big accomplishment in exploration, in cold weather exploration, was the crossing of the Greenland ice cap from east to west. And no one had ever done that before. In fact, no one was certain that Greenland was entirely covered in an ice cap. There was all kinds of speculation of what the Greenland interior might be like. And he demonstrated by skiing across it that it was in fact an ice cap. But so I'd read some biographies of Nansen, and he would do all kinds of, in his younger years, he would do all kinds of crazy things on cross-country skis. He used them as sort of a means of long distance travel. For example, he was from Oslo in the east of Norway, and he went to university in Bergen on the west coast. I think there's about 300 or 400 miles apart, and there's a mountain range in between. So most students, of course, would take the train from Oslo to Bergen for their university, and then, if they were going to go back, take the train back. But what Nansen did was, during his Christmas holidays, he would ski back to Oslo to see his family. So he would just hop on his skis and then cross these 400 miles of mountains back to Oslo. So from him, I got the idea that, skis were a great way of traveling long distances. And the next thing so this is a picture of cross-country skiing in the Alps near Bergamo. So the next thing I had hatched this plan in my head of skiing across Canada. Now, why Canada? Well, Canada is one of the big countries in which it is possible to do something like this. Obviously, Canada, Russia really are the two candidates for like a continental-sized country that has a long enough winter to be able to ski across the country. And then also, I happen to be a dual citizen of Canada. My father is Canadian. So I knew I wouldn't have any problems spending a lot of time there legally. Now the problem with all of this planning that I was doing in my head is that I had never talked about it to my wife. If anyone who's married can imagine, or in a relationship with other human beings, immediately understands how that is a problem. But I, at the time, did not. So obviously I had kind of a screw loose in some way. So needless to say, when I did finally announce to my wife, and it was basically that I was essentially announcing that I intended to do this the next winter, it did not go over very well. And so the fallout from that, from my decision to do this, in spite of the fact that my wife was very uncomfortable with it and very worried, is kind of a secondary theme of the book. And in a way, the journey across winter becomes kind of a metaphor for this crisis, which lasted for a very long time. Actually, I may as well say it just to give you some context for when I wrap things up at the end, that the journey led to a 5-year separation with my wife, or from my wife, I should say. So in spite of all this, 14 months after announcing this plan to my wife, here I was at the bus station in Vancouver with my huge pile of gear ready to strike off into winter. So I began by taking a series of boats and then finally a larger ship up the inside passage along the coast of British Columbia up towards the Alaska Panhandle. And I disembarked. Let's go through a couple of pictures here from along the way. I disembarked in a town called Prince Rupert in British Columbia, which is Canada's northernmost Pacific port. It's just a few miles shy of the southern end of the Alaska Panhandle. And it was an uncharacteristically sunny day. This is a picture taken just as we're approaching the harbor. Like Seattle or Vancouver, Prince Rupert, that whole coast, is a very cloudy and rainy sort of place. And so it seemed like a good omen to me that the sun was out. Here I am on the ship, scribbling in my diary. This is how I spent many hours of my evenings all through the winter. Now, so like I just said, Prince Rupert is a place that is kind of rainy and cloudy all winter long, and its temperature kind of hovers in the low 40s. It doesn't really get a true winter, at least not at sea level. And so I didn't expect there to be snow, and in fact, there wasn't snow. And so when I landed, I freighted all my skiing equipment and my sled and things like that. I freighted them inland to the first inland town, which is called Terrace, British Columbia. It's about 90 miles from the Pacific. And I started walking with all the rest of my gear on my back. I ended up kind of hurting my knee a little bit temporarily. And so when I got to this town, Terrace, I decided to rest for a couple of days in a motel. And in the meantime, I'd realized that I was carrying way too much stuff with me. And so I used the opportunity to kind of sort through things, and I gave some things away and took things to thrift stores and sent a few things home, and really sort of tightened up the kit that I was going to be hauling around with me. Excuse me. Now, while I was in this town of Terrace, winter arrived with a vengeance. So a series of blizzards, just like one day after day, came into town and covered the whole town with probably a foot or two of snow, and the mountains were covered in snow. So I knew that I was going to be skiing very soon. And so after a few days there, I headed into a nearby valley, the valley of the Copper River. And my first objective was to get over a range of mountains called the Kitimat Range, which is a part of the larger Coast Range. And the Coast Range is essentially the Canadian extension of what in Washington and Oregon are called the Cascades. So it goes all the way up to Southeast Alaska. And so I was going to be skiing across this pass, and it was about a 100-mile section from the town I was in to a town on the opposite side of the pass. Sorry, I wanted to read something, but it's not for a minute. So the climb up to the pass it took much longer than I expected, partly because the snow was very wet and heavy and deep at this point. And so it was just kind of this long trudge. And there was one day as I approached the pass where I covered about 3 miles, or even maybe slightly less than 3 miles, over the course of a pretty long day of skiing. So it was slow going. It was very hard work, but in retrospect, it was a good way to start my journey because it sort of toughened me up pretty quickly physically. The first 20 miles or so, there were snowmobile tracks, which were nice because it meant that I didn't have to break trails, so it was a lot less work. I like this picture because it gives you a sense of the sort of staircase progression I was making. It was like there'd be a steep climb, and then a gradual section, then another steep climb for 5 days or so, like that. And this is a picture looking back west towards the Pacific, and you can see sort of the steps going up. Now, this picture here is kind of a parenthesis for anyone in the audience who's not a cross-country skier and perhaps is wondering how the heck I'm skiing uphill with ski. I mean, how I'm skiing uphill. People think you ski downhill. Like, how can you move uphill on slippery skis? The answer is climbing skins, what are called climbing skins. So you see on the base of this, on my right ski, this orange strip of fabric. And what climbing skins are these pieces essentially of fabric that adhere to the bases of your skis. And the nap of the fabric is diagonally backwards oriented. And what that does is enable the ski to slide forward over the snow. But as soon as backward pressure is exerted, the fibers kind of bite into the snow and break your backward slide. And so you can just slide slowly up hills that way. Now, this skin that I have on this particular ski, and this is more for any of you who are skiers and are interested in the finer points, this skin is what's called a half skin. And so it's just for, it just would give me enough traction to haul my sled over flat ground. If I were climbing up something really steep, there's a skin that covers the entire length of the ski. Okay, so that's end of parenthesis. So as I approached the pass, I was getting up in the middle of these pretty big mountains, and they were, I mean, I wasn't going to be going up to the heights or anything like that, but they were flanking me like this. What you see in this picture, there was something identical in mirror image, sort of on the other side. And you know, I had to creep up the slopes along the side, these talus slopes that were covered in snow, which it can be kind of dangerous because they're heavily laden with snow and they're quite steep. And so this is like classic avalanche terrain. And just as I was beginning to worry about avalanches, I suddenly heard a boom about 500 yards in front of me, and the whole side of this mountain just slid down and sent this billow of powder up into the air. Now, it took me a couple of minutes to retrieve my camera from my sled, but you know, even this picture taken 2 or 3 minutes after the slide shows you that the snow still hasn't settled to the ground, which gives you an idea of, like, it was a pretty big avalanche. So that was unnerving, and I knew I was going to have to cross that slope soon. In a way, you know, it had already discharged its snow, so in a way it was safer, but still all around me there were slopes like this. So that was kind of disturbing. But I eventually made it over the pass and down the other side, and I started to meet people so the journey was, in a way, it was about solitude. I wanted to be alone, but I was also interested in meeting people along the way. But as I did start to meet people, when I came to the first town on the other side of this pass, I started to realize just how important these human connections were. And over the course of the winter, it became a very important part of the journey, and it's certainly one of the most important parts of the book, as you will discover if you read it. So on the trail again, when I came down the other side of the pass, I met some people, as I mentioned, and they invited me to spend a night at their place. And so I kind of took a rest day and spent the day with these people it was a couple who were about my age, and we had similar interests. So it was a really nice time. But then I, you know, hit the trail again. And this picture is not a terribly interesting picture, but it's there so you can see what my sleeping bag looked like if you're interested. It was a down sleeping bag. It was very thick, had 2 layers on top of it. I won't say anything more about the technical specifications. I could talk a lot about the sleeping bag. And here I was in a cabin that I kind of stumbled across in this little town way out in northern central British Columbia. It was actually on a native reserve. And it was kind of a summer camp, and some local people said, you should sleep in that cabin, it's better than your tent. And so I just spent a night in this cabin. Now it was about this time, I was probably altogether, including the time I'd been walking and taking the ship up and then skied for a week, or a little over a week. I was probably close to 3 weeks into the journey, and I began to realize that my idea of skiing all the way across the continent, all the way across Canada, was overly ambitious. And so I started to come to terms with the fact that I probably wasn't going to make it all the way across Canada. Now, just to jump ahead to the end for a minute, and so you have some geographical context, this is a map of the journey that I actually made by the end of the winter. So you can see I started up at Prince Rupert near Alaska in the northwest, and then basically skied east following the 55th parallel, roughly, which corresponds to kind of the heart of the boreal forest, the evergreen and birch and aspen forest that we think of when we think of northern places like Scandinavia or Canada, which for me basically means the ideal terrain for cross-country skiing. And then I skied across Alberta and Saskatchewan onto the Canadian Shield, which I'll mention later, and then into Manitoba, where I finally wound up in March of the following year. Actually, I think, yeah, I'll put it on this picture. So one question that often comes up is there a single trail that you were following across, this section of northern Canada? I mean, how were you finding your way across the landscape? And the answer is no, there's not a single trail. So I did a great deal of route planning beforehand. I planned the route in almost down to the yard. And I had to make some minor adjustments along the way, but I basically followed my plan as far as I went. And so what I did was so that first section crossing the mountains, for example, I was just following ordinary trails, the kinds of trails you would hike on in the summertime. I was skiing on them, obviously, instead of hiking. In other places, I relied on snowmobile trails, of which there are many in this part of Canada. I relied on logging roads a lot, especially in British Columbia. Now, the thing you have to understand, so there are tens of thousands of miles of logging roads in northern British Columbia. But most of them at any given time are not plowed because they're not being used. And so it's not really worthwhile to plow them. So they tend to plow the roads in areas where logs are actively being taken out any given winter. So the picture in front of you now is a logging road that's being used. You can see it's been plowed. Fortunately, they don't plow them right down to the gravel. And so I could still ski on them. And there's not very much traffic. Like a truck will come by every 2 or 3 hours on work days, none on weekends. But most of the logging roads I was using were not plowed, so there was just this strip of land through the wilderness. And this here, I'm obviously closer to civilization because there's a power line, but usually it was just sort of a narrow 1-lane gravel road, and it was covered in 2 or 3 feet of snow, so it was like this perfect ski trail. In other places, I relied on the railroad in northern Alberta. Now that's another thing that I have to kind of explain, because we tend to think of busy commuter rail corridors, but in Canada there are railroads that go places where there are no ordinary automobile roads. Like it's the only way of moving cargo across the land in lots of places. And so these railroads are very far from settled places often, and they see very little traffic. So a train will come by once a day, sometimes once every 2 days, or even every 3 days. And if it happens to snow between the times when a train has come by, the tracks are obviously covered in snow. And so it becomes kind of like these logging roads. It's just this this cut line through the woods that's covered in snow. It's kind of dramatic when a train does come along in that situation. I don't know if you remember, if those of you who have seen Dr. Zhivago, it's probably been a while, but there's the scene when they're going east to the Urals in the wintertime, and the train, there's a shot taken from the ground, and the train comes around the corner and just throws all the snow out of the way with its plow. So I saw lots of scenes like that. And then when I got into Saskatchewan and Manitoba, I did lots of skiing on frozen lakes. So the Canadian Shield, as you may know, is covered with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, I don't know, of little lakes and also big lakes. All of them, of course, are frozen and covered in snow, and so those become nice ski trails as well. Now, at this point, I'd like to read a passage, and there are two reasons, I guess, I want to read this. I think it's in some ways characteristic of parts of the book. So there's a little bit of geographical description, kind of in the classic manner of old-fashioned travel writers, some of whom I greatly admire. And then there's kind of a funny meeting that I hope you'll find entertaining. And these two sections are very close together, so I'm going to read them just as a single passage. I see there's something in the chat. Let me see what this says. It might be important. Are we able to connect trails to logging roads, to roads, etc.? What kinds of maps enable you to do this? Okay. Well, I'll answer the question since I've seen it. So, you have to understand that like I was in thinly populated places, and so any towns that were along the lake tended to be very small towns. And there was snow everywhere. And the roads in the north tend not to be plowed right down to the snow. And so in most cases, I could just kind of ski through a town. Often, roads intersect the railroads, because the railroads obviously connect one town to another. And then sometimes in logging roads, of course, eventually come back to towns because the mills are in towns. So they're all everything is connected. And as far as maps are concerned, I planned using first Google Maps just to kind of get an overview of the landscape and to see what kind of infrastructures were around the towns, whether there were railroads coming through and whatnot. And then I also had Canadian Geological Survey maps, hundreds of them, which are digitized, but I printed them out. I had sort of scale reductions printed out, and I had these stuffed into my food boxes for each section of the way. Thank you for the question. Excuse me. So I am I'm reading about an area in north central British Columbia. Like to give you an idea, there aren't really any towns that most people have heard of, but if the biggest town in the area is called Prince George, and I'm kind of in the area to the north and northwest of Prince George, if you feel like looking at a map. All right, excuse me. I was at the southern end of one of the remotest stretches of British Columbia. The slender fingers of Takla Lake reached from its outlet at the Middle River, which I had just crossed, into a roadless north. The railroad from Fort St. James to Dease Lake in far northern British Columbia was planned and begun once, but construction was abandoned in 1977. And now the tracks lie buried under snow along the Middle River, and the train cars wait rusting outside Fort St. James. East of Takla Lake are the Nation Lakes, a latitudinally oriented chain along whose length I had originally intended to ski before I was advised not to by a hunting guide in Terrace. Farther east lies Williston Lake. It is a marvel of engineering, pooling the waters of the Parsnip and Finley river systems, where they converge as the Peace River before funneling them east and then sharply north to the Arctic Ocean via the Slave and Mackenzie rivers. The Slave River takes its name from the so-called Slavey people, a subgroup of the Dene, As with many demonyms, the name was given by their neighbors, the Cree, who once enslaved Dene captives in times of war. The Cree word first entered French as esclave and later English as slave. The Slavey prefer to call themselves the Deneta or Dechcho Dene. The Mackenzie River takes its name from the Scottish explorer Alexander Mackenzie, the first European to follow it to its outlet in 1789. 4 years later, or 12 years before Lewis and Clark reached the mouth of the Columbia River, he became the first person to cross the North American continent from Atlantic to Pacific, north of Mexico. The Peace River, according to Mackenzie's accounts of his travels, is named for a place called Peace Point, near where it joins the Slave, which commemorates a historical boundary between Slavey and Beaver, or Dane-Za territories. Williston is British Columbia's largest lake. It lies astride the Rocky Mountain Trench, and its shores have seen very little in the way of roads or settlement. Northwest of this cluster of lakes, Babine, Takla, the Nations, and Williston, is a wilderness that stretches to the Yukon with little interruption. South of it are a few logging roads that converge at Fort St. James. Locals in the fort give these directions to visitors from outside. Go to the end of the world, then turn right. Fort St. James was where I would spend Christmas. To me, as I traveled southeast, it seemed like the center of the world. Any human being I should chance to see now would doubtless be headed there. The road I emerged on, these are logging roads, the road I emerged on after crossing the Middle River Bridge is known as the 300 Road. It runs from northwest to southeast, and its snow was clean. The clear cuts here were more numerous and bigger. A cold wind ripped down the side of the mountain and sliced through my jacket. I quit shortly before sunset, having covered 5 miles since coming over the river. The snow was deep and fine, and I had to take special care to prepare my tent site. Now, we go into the following day, and I kind of keep skiing along this abandoned logging road, and I don't see anyone for the whole day. And it's getting towards the end of the day. Soon it was dark. I couldn't tell whether my skis were scraping gravel or broken ice, so I reluctantly dug out my headlamp, the first and only time I would ever ski with it, to spare my equipment unnecessary wear. It was a gradual climb through flecks of white shooting out of the darkness into the bright cast of my lamp. With the light, I could see nothing outside what was immediately ahead of me, and the resulting boredom seemed to slow time down. To make it pass, I counted to 10,000, counting 1 beat for every 4 strides, then started over. Eventually, the realization that I was counting to 10,000 for a second time seemed to swell the sense of boredom, so I ordered my body to keep up kicking legs, poling arms, and following a straight line, and switched off my lamp. A pinpoint of light flickering behind tree trunks in the distance suddenly brought me back to normal awareness. The camp was all it could be. So I should tell you, in the meantime, I'd met a logger who was kind of out along this road working, and he told me that there was a logging camp. I think it was 25 kilometers on, and that that I might find a place to sleep there if I wanted to sleep indoors, and I kind of did at that point. But it was Christmas holidays, so he said at most there would be a caretaker there, and there wouldn't be any loggers in camp. So, if I wanted a place to sleep, I should go find this caretaker, and he might be able to give me something. So a pinpoint of light flickered behind tree trunks in the distance suddenly brought me back to normal awareness. The camp was all it could be. It was the only light in tens of miles. It grew closer and closer until finally I skied into its jarring glow. I saw movement in a trailer marked Rec Room, skied up to it, and unclipped my bindings. When I stepped off my skis, for the first time in more than 25 miles, pain ripped through my right knee so sharply that it felt as though my leg had been twisted around a crankshaft. The leg folded, and I caught myself with my arms on the ground. I'd have screamed had I not been in a furtive state of mind. I limped up the porch, shook my leg out, and knocked on the door. When it opened, there was a tall man across the threshold. He seemed surprised that the knocking in the night had been anything more than his imagination. He must have been doubly surprised to see a man wearing a long beard drawn down by icicles, standing in the dark as the snow settled soundlessly, and no vehicle in sight, but only a sled and a pair of skis. "Can I come in?" I said. He waved me in. There was another man inside. Both were in their 30s. Aerosmith came from a pair of speakers, drowning out the sound of a flickering television. "We're working on getting drunk," said the man I'd not met, a blonde, bearded fellow who, were he not sitting slumped in a reclining armchair, would have fit in a Wagner opera. He wore shorts and raised a gallon of Smirnoff as a visual prop. It had a pump action handle on it, so you could squeeze shots into your glass like ketchup. He fingered the nozzle cap lovingly. On a coffee table lay a platter of cold bacon and onion rings that the two men picked at. "You gonna spend the night?" the tall man said. "I would appreciate it. I'll sleep anywhere. I'm just grateful for the roof." "No one's in camp besides us. You can sleep in any room you like. Do you want a cup of coffee or something?" "That sounds perfect," I said. The tall man went to fetch me a cup of coffee, and I sat on a corner of the couch to talk to the bearded man. He told me that his friend, Neil, was a camp cook, while he, Torfin, was only visiting. They came from Campbell River on Vancouver Island. Neil would work for 29 days straight in camp, and then he had 13 days off, during which he would drive the 750 miles home and the same distance back again. He always drove. Camp was vacant now for Christmas holidays, but someone had to keep an eye on things, so he and Neil were here playing video games, eating cold bacon, and building their alcohol tolerance. Torfin spoke as if he were talking to himself. He rambled. At one point, his monologue veered off into a Scandinavian language. "Are you speaking Norwegian?" I said. "Jo," he said in a resonant voice. He rattled another sentence off, which I took to mean, "Who's asking?" He told me, in English, that his father was Norwegian. He was a Norwegian citizen himself and had lived in Norway for a few years. He'd even been in the Norwegian army. Neil came back and joined what conversation there was, which was soon reduced to Torfin's deranged soliloquizing in Norwegian, peppered with English expressions of marvel at the genius of the vodka spout. Neil had the good grace to ask if I wanted to retire to a bunkhouse and showed me the way, stopping in the kitchen to fill a bag with snacks for me. In my narrow room, consisting of a bed, metal wardrobe, and television, I ate a sandwich and then went to the drying room, a fixture of every bush camp, to spread out all my gear. In the bathroom, I washed my cooking utensils. I turned on the CBC in camp via satellite when I returned to my bedroom. December 21st, which had ended minutes before, had been prophesied doomsday by the Mayans, the newscast reported, but the prophecy had apparently been wrong. I imagined how my day might have differed if the world-ending events had happened and concluded that things would be about the same. I might even be here in camp with Neil and Torfin, one of the last 3 men on Earth. Human extinction would only be a matter of hours after that. All right, so that's Neil and Torfin. Okay, let's get on some slides. So this is just a picture of me coming into a rail yard in a town called Chetwynd, British Columbia. This is on a rail line out somewhere far from towns. These are some mouse tracks, which is a strange picture to include, but often when I moved across the land, I would kind of think about how other animals were far more graceful than I was, and this is just one instance of seeing this mouse track that looked so much more elegant than my broken ski track with the clunky sled dragged along behind. This is the Peace River, which I mentioned in that reading. This is an Alberta prairie scene. Like I mentioned before that most of my skiing was done in the boreal forest, but in Alberta, the prairie pushes farther north than in the other provinces. And so sometimes I would ski through little sections of prairie. I would kind of exit the woods for a couple of days and ski through the prairie, just because it was the easiest way to go for whatever reason. It tended to be very windy, and the coldest parts of my winter were spent in places like that. This is another prairie. The reason I included this picture is just to show you, you don't see it all that well, but there's this kind of serrated pattern in the snow drifts from the constant wind lashing the land. This is another Alberta scene. I like this twilight. I had, particularly in December, January, there are these long dawns and long dusks. It tended to get light late and dark early, but there was always a dusk kind of at the threshold of night. This is a grain elevator, obviously, something that I didn't really expect to see, but again, I said in Alberta, I came down onto the prairie every now and then, and that's what I found. This is a large lake called Lesser Slave Lake, the first large lake I came to. This picture is here to, sorry if I'm going a little quickly now, but I want to get to another reading and some questions. This is what my camp looked like on any given evening. I had this tunnel tent, which is quite wind resistant. At this point, I was into Saskatchewan, and so the terrain is flatter, much flatter than it had been in British Columbia, but it was very pleasant. It was February. The days were longer. The weather had gotten a lot sunnier for whatever reason. And so this was just one of those beautiful days with sparkles on the snow. There's the snowmobile track, isn't the most picturesque thing, but these are my skis. If I'd been there in person, I would have brought my skis for you to have a look at, but since I'm not, they were made by a little Norwegian company, and they had this picture on them of Roald Amundsen, who's the other famous Norwegian explorer. I mentioned Nansen before. So Amundsen is the first person to get to the South Pole. This is a cabin that belonged to a character I met along the way. This is the inside of it. His name was Don Skopik, but he went by the Cossack. He was a Canadian of Russian origin. And he was a dog musher, and he was just this northern character. And he was highly amusing. And so there's an entire chapter in the book dedicated to him. Here I have just come through a very harrowing experience on a large lake in Saskatchewan. A storm descended rather suddenly on the lake, and I became completely disoriented. And it was the one time when I thought I might not make it. Here we are looking at a lake called Lac Laurange, which is also in Saskatchewan. This is the largest lake I skied across. Where I crossed it, it was between 30 and 40 miles. It took me parts of 3 days to get across, and I spent the night on it twice. This is another shot from the same lake. The horizon there that you see is an island, not the mainland, just to give you a sense of the scale. And here's one of my camps on the lake. I want to read a little section actually about skiing on lakes on the Canadian Shield. So let me just find my page. All right, let's see. So here I'm actually a little bit west, a few days west of where these pictures were taken, but same kind of idea. I skied southeast across Pine House Lake, rounded a point, slid past an island over a small pressure ridge. This thing that you see in this picture here is a pressure ridge. It forms when two huge sheets of lake ice collide. It's kind of like plate tectonics. One sheet rides up over the other and they form these ridges. So I rounded a point, slid past an island over a small pressure ridge, and kept my eyes peeled for a large angled boulder and a buried pickup truck that I was told marked the entrance to the first portage trail. Pine House Lake, Bar Lake, Johansson Lake, Neil Lake, Beznard Lake. The lakes of northern Saskatchewan are strung together by well-trod trails the width of a canoe. They are low, cozy tunnels through dense bush or sunken traces across wind-blown tracts of muskeg. To travel by them, by these little trails, requires a leap of faith, for there's no way besides hearsay to verify their existence from afar. Yet miles and miles of travel are staked on their presence. Along the most frequented historical routes, they are marked with dashed lines on topographical maps, but there's often no way of knowing when they were last used. And trails, when disused, disappear. But if you give your trust to the lakes of the north and the hidden trails that connect them, you will find a network as seamless as any modern highway system. To travel this region is a lesson in the power of trust and cooperation. The voyageurs who traveled this country in the olden days used lob trees to mark the positions of trail breaks on the often monotonous horizons of the taiga. A tall tree would be stripped of its lower branches, leaving an awkward tuft at the crown that stood out from the surrounding trees, even from the far side of a miles-wide lake. I had no such markers to guide me. Most of the time, old snowmobile tracks were good guides, but in one instance on Bar Lake, it seemed to me that they were heading off course from the slight dip in the tree line that often marks the point where two bodies of water come closest together, which is also usually a carrying place for canoes. I left the track and made for the point, breaking trail through half a mile of heavy snow. I was vindicated when I got to the trail. The snowmobile tracks reached the same point, but had swung south a couple of extra miles before turning around and coming back to hit the link. At one point, I found a pile of fishing nets. I'd been told I might see commercial fishermen out on the remote lakes if I saw anyone. I decided to stop for lunch in hopes that the fisherman might come around. He did not. Only a little mouse shot out of a tunnel in the snow and scribbled back and forth over the surface before going back under, where he was safe from at least his aerial predators. When I came to the mid-sized Beznard Lake, I skied a few miles down its length and then spotted a summer cottage hidden among the trees on an island. Night was beginning to fall, so I crossed over to it. The snow in the bush around the house was especially deep, well above my hips, and I was exhausted lugging my sled up the slope from the lake. The door was unlocked. Inside, the cottage was rustic but well appointed, with a wood stove, a pair of sofas, some books and board games, and even an indoor pit latrine. There was a bin of firewood behind the stove, and within an hour I had the place warm. I cooked my supper and melted a day's worth of water on top of the stove. Then I sat back in an armchair in front of the fire to watch the flames and write in my diary. After a restful night on the couch, I packed up my things, refilled the firewood bin from a pile buried in the snow, and left a note thanking the owners of the cottage. The following summer, I received a friendly email from the owner of the cabin who chided me playfully for having left the firewood bin not quite as full as he had left it. He told me he was glad his cottage had been of use and that his decision to follow the old northern tradition of not locking doors was a principled one. I left my island paradise in a nasty wind under overcast skies. Traveling again, I saw a moving black dot in the bleak distance. It came closer and revealed itself as a snowmobile. It approached me and I could see that it was towing an empty orange sled that looked like mine but was perhaps 5 times as voluminous and covered in grime and blood stains. The driver was a silent native fisherman who wore furs. He was bulky, but his skin was tight and weather-beaten. His eyes were as drawn as Inuit eyes. He slowed down only long enough to tell me that I was on the right track for Laurange and motored on in the direction I had just come from. Okay. Just a couple of more images. So shortly after crossing that lake, Lac Laurange, I crossed into Manitoba for the final couple of weeks of my journey. This is a picture which I've included. It was taken by a newspaper reporter in a little town called Flin Flon, Manitoba. And it's a good picture because it's an action shot and you can see me in my normal everyday clothes with my glacier glasses, which help to cut the glare from the snow. The smokestack, it looks like I'm skiing along the New Jersey Turnpike or something, but the smokestack so Flin Flon is a major mining center. It's a tiny town, but a big mining center. And so that's the smelter from the mine. And then this is me, it's a picture that was taken by the same guy. This is me skiing off out of town back into the wilderness. And then finally, I mentioned before that this decision to go on this journey caused a huge rift between me and my wife. And for a long time, I assumed that that our marriage was done. But my wife, fortunately, is a very forgiving and understanding person. And we were able, after 5 years, almost it seems miraculous to me, we were able to work out our differences. And so for a number of years now, 4 years, I suppose, we've been back together and fortunately are still happily married. Now I'll end on that note. Actually, there's one thing I would like to say, I nearly forgot to say. At the beginning, I mentioned the Austrian ski racer, Tony Matt, as a kind of this story, this legend that I had in my head. I should mention that when I sat down, when I knew that I wanted to include the story of Matt somehow in the book, I thought, well, I better go and read about him and make sure I've got all the facts straight. And when I did, I found the story of the American Inferno and his record-breaking descent of Mount Washington, but I couldn't find anything about this business of him running over his skis and never skiing again. So I read some more, still found nothing, and eventually contacted a ski historian at the New England Ski History Museum in Franconia, New Hampshire. And long story short, he told me that the story that didn't happen. My father simply made the story up, which is kind of typical of my dad. But anyway, it was a good story, and I think there's kind of a lesson in there. You know, sometimes we have these myths that determine that shape our decision-making processes, and then they turn out not even to be true. So there you have it. I would. It went a bit longer than I was supposed to. I apologize, but if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them. And I see there was something in the chat already again. Let me take it off of. Sorry, let me leave screen share so that you can see me properly. Okay. What wildlife did you see along your route? Thank you for the question, Joy. I didn't see as much wildlife as many people expect, partly because it was winter and animals tend to be less active, especially in cold places. But nevertheless, I saw a lot of little animals like grouse and snowshoe hares, things like that. The animals that it was most exciting for me to see were a fisher, which is a mid-sized member of the weasel family, and they're quite shy. They're hard to see, and so I saw one of them, and it was exciting. And that was one of those animals that I saw, and I saw how gracefully it moved over the snow, and I kind of wished that I could be a fisher, that I could channel the fisher's locomotive abilities. So that was one that was exciting. And then also a ptarmigan, which is a northern bird or a high altitude bird. It's like a little kind of, I'm not an ornithologist, but like it's a kind of a little partridge-like bird that turns white in the winter and becomes camouflage. So that was exciting. I'd never seen one before. I saw lots of moose, especially for some reason in northeastern British Columbia. There was one day in particular when I saw close to 30 moose in a single day, skiing along a lonely section of railroad. All right, any other questions? Does your wife ski? Good practical question. My wife does not ski, which helps explain why. I mean, that's not the only reason, but so that made my desire to do this even more, even harder for her to grasp.
Anyone else have questions? Do you intend to ever continue your trail?
Do I? No, I certainly in the wintertime. No, it was, I mean, there are lots of wonderful things about this journey and lots of nice memories, and I enjoyed writing about it, but it's not an experience I wish to repeat. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. It was very physically and mentally also challenging. So I still love cross-country skiing, but I tend to, come home to sleep at night, and I love camping in the summertime and fall, but I don't feel the need to do it anymore in the winter.
Do you have?
Did you carry any weapons?
Thank you for your question. I actually, for the first week or so, that the part that I talked about where there was no snow, and I was walking inland, I carried a 12 gauge shotgun with the big game slugs. My fear was grizzlies. Lots of people travel in that area without firearms, and I would have preferred to do so, but that was kind of one of the concessions at the point when I was still making concessions to my wife. She kind of implored me to carry some form of self-defense against grizzlies. But once I got it, after that first week, it was winter, and so the bears, I knew that they would be hibernating. So in that town of Terrace, where I got rid of all that stuff, one of the things I did was sold my gun to a hunting guide, and so it was just the first week that I had it, and it weighed a lot, so I was glad to get rid of it.
I think there's a question from Joy. What year was this that you did your trek?
So it was winter of 2012 and 13. So I started mid-November 2012, and I ended mid-March 2013.
I'm wondering what are your favorite sort of journey books?
Oh, that's a good question that isn't often asked. Thank you for asking. My absolute favorite. I have kind of old-fashioned taste, I have to say, and I like English travel writers particularly. And my favorite travel writer is Patrick Leigh Fermor, who wrote a trilogy of books describing a journey he made in the early 1930s between London and Constantinople. He went up the Rhine. He just went across the English Channel and then went up the Rhine and down the Danube to the Black Sea. And he's just an incredible writer and also a very learned and highly entertaining guide, let's say. So I like him. American writers, Peter Matheson, I think, is a masterful travel writer, not only a travel writer. So those are a couple.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? What's the weirdest question you've gotten in these talks?
The weirdest? I haven't had any really weird questions, to be honest. Yeah, I can't think of any weird questions. People are too scared, too shy to ask weird questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a whole nother talk, but like, what did you bring for medicine?
Not much. I had it for basic first aid kit with Band-Aids and like alcohol and stuff like that to clean wounds, and I had an kind of a general purpose antibiotic. Don't ask me what it was, but it was given to me. So before I said I was in Italy before I left, and so my wife, among the things that my wife made me do, which there were signs of the fact that she cared about me, but so she made me go to my doctor in Italy and have a physical to make sure that I was didn't have any like secret heart problems or anything, things that I didn't know about. And she also had him give me like some painkillers, prescription painkillers that were like in case I did something serious harm to myself. And this all-purpose antibiotic, which I never used. So these were things that just were there in case I had like a serious emergency, which fortunately I didn't. But other than that, just basic things like you would have, like bandages and disinfectants and ibuprofen, stuff for dealing with blisters like moleskins and things like that, but nothing. Yeah, I had a satellite telephone, which if I'd been in a real emergency, that would have been my contact with the outside world. I see another question. Did you ever hear of a Norwegian skier in British Columbia at Mount Assiniboine named Erling Strom? No, I have not heard of Mr. Strom. Would you like to tell me about him? Or should I look him up on my own time?
Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to do. Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
You are.
Okay. He was in the 1930s in Assiniboine, and he was a member of the Hall of Fame of skiers.
Okay.
But he persuaded the Canadian government to build the Mount Assiniboine Lodge, which was the first backcountry lodge for skiers
Oh, wow.
established. And you could only get into the lodge. Subsequently, my husband and I went in by 2 days by horseback with pack horses.
Oh, wow.
He wouldn't allow anybody to come in any other way. And he apparently, and I've forgotten which mountain, he and a Italian count of some sort skied down this mountain, which nobody else had ever done in British Columbia. So I gather he had fame as a skier in the 30s. And then he took over the running of the lodge for about 50 years, which is where we met him.
Right.
And was quite a storyteller, very crusty Norwegian when you were on the trail if you didn't do things the way he told you to. But a charming storyteller. He knew the Von Trapp family from Austria and so forth. And I just thought, since he started out being a famous skier, that maybe you tripped across his name in the history books, in which case I would just say that I met him.
I do know a few of these crusty Norwegian ski pioneers in North America. There's Snowshoe Thompson, who's associated with the Sierras. His name wasn't, well, it was Thompson, but I forget what his first name was. But anyway, they called him Snowshoe Thompson. And he's often credited with introducing skiing, cross-country skiing to the Sierras. And then in the Northeast, there's Jack Rabbit Johansson, another famous Norwegian, who was first in the Adirondack. He lived to be about 112 years old. He skied until the very end. He lived in the Adirondacks for a while, and then he moved up to the Gatineau Hills in Eastern Ontario. And I mentioned a couple of these guys. There was a trapper called Ragnar Johansson, I can't remember, in northern Manitoba. I don't remember whether he was Swedish or Norwegian, though, to be honest. Anyway, he was a particularly crusty and misanthropic character. I talk a little bit about him in the book too. So yeah, I'm fascinated with these people, and they're also energetic. It's incredible. There's something in the water in Norway. I don't know.
It must be. Well, it's a fascinating story. How long did it take you to write the book? After you kept a journal, I gather. But
yeah, I kept a journal. So I wrote a very simple draft the winter immediately following the journey, a year later. But it was basically just kind of a chronological description of the journey itself, and so it didn't have any of the stuff about putting it in the context of my life in the background. But I at the time I didn't feel ready to do that yet, and so I put it in a drawer and left it for about 4 years, and then I kind of wrote a book proposal based on what I had, and just started sending out publishers. And it was about 2018 when Mountaineers Books, an editor of Mountaineers Books, expressed interest and said she thought they'd like to buy it. And so I pulled it back out at that point and really started to work on it. And then as the expected publication date drew closer, I started working with an editor, and so she did a bit of help me kind of get some of the dross, skim off some of the dross, I guess, basically. So really, it was over the course of probably 3 years or so that it took. I mean, not obviously of constant work, but there were about 3 years where I was working on it.
would you do it again?
The journey?
Yeah. I don't mean repeat it, but knowing what you went through, would you do it again?
Oh, that's a better way of putting it. I might, but I would do things a lot differently. And maybe the story might be less interesting for that.
Joy, we should put in a plug for your book talk, which Joy has a travel book an
Oh.
adventure book coming out, and we have her, she'll be at the library on Thursday, December 9th, so save that date.
Right down.
Did you want to say anything about your book, Joy?
Well, mine is a story of my husband's and my birding and wildlife photography on all 10 continents over a period of some 50 years. I lost my husband to COVID-19, and
I'm sorry.
towards the end, I started reading our old diaries to him, because I kept a diary and wrote every night on all of our trips.
Yeah.
And I began realizing there were a lot of good stories there. And so after he died, I threw myself into writing the book based on my diary. So I was not having to do original writing as you were, because the diaries were there, but I was taking excerpts from them and then making appropriate transitions and so forth. And I should have, hopefully, in about 3 weeks, it should be out.
All right.
And
I'll keep an eye out for it. And yeah,
it's called From Schnitzel to Knuckle and Everything That Happened in Between. My husband was Austrian. The first meal I ever cooked for him was Wiener Schnitzel, and the last thing 5 days before he died was Viennese knuckle, and he didn't want to eat much, but when I mentioned that, he was in favor of having Viennese knuckle, which is a homemade noodle kind of thing with scrambled eggs. And it was everything that happened in between.
all right. Well, that sounds like quite the tale. It makes me think of a friend of mine. He's a serious bird watcher in Canada, actually. So I think and she goes to a lot of. Will this be virtually visible, or is it going to be in person? This talk.
I don't know. What is it going to be, Courtney?
Yeah,
Who
we
knows?
need to talk about
December
it.
9th.
Well, never mind. I'll
Definitely virtual, but possibly also in
okay.
person.
So I'll tell this friend in Canada. She'll love it. I can. It sounds like her kind of book. But one thing, did you say 10 continents? At the
No, I said 10 accounts of 7 continents.
Oh.
Yeah. Did I say 10 continents? I'm sorry if I did. No, I don't think there's been any tectonic plate shifts of late. No, it's all 7 continents, but it's 10
Okay.
journeys on these various places.
I look forward to that. Thank you for telling me about it.
Well, I found your story particularly interesting because of my own interests, but also how you were, doing a chronology of what you went through on these trips, what you encountered, people you encountered, like Erling Strom that we had encountered, who we were going to cross horseback on loose shale, and I was scared to death. And I said, Erling, I want to get off and walk. And he said, you sit there. The horse knows what he's doing, even if you don't. So I did. I gave the horse reins, and it got me across the mountain shale.
Wow.
But he was a crusty Norwegian.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing some of your stories with me.
Yeah.
Nice.
Does anyone have any other questions for Anders? Well, this has been a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thanks to all of you for coming. And thank you for your questions and your conversation. I've really enjoyed this.